Woo! Hey, it's Dr. Mitch. We're going to talk about prescription drugs, over-the-counter drugs, dietary supplements. Want to emphasize we've got about an hour's worth of material here. I'm going to do it in 3 reasonable chunks. We're going to start with the relevant laws. I know you didn't take this class because you want to go to law school, but it just sort of explains how we ended up with some drugs being over-the-counter and some drugs being prescription. I'm going to get into the clinical testing process, so how we decide a drug can be legal and available. Tip my hat to the patents. Talk about some common prescription drugs and then some common over-the-counter drugs. But the recurring theme is going to be that you are the chooser. You're in charge of what goes in your body. You're in charge of what you ingest. If you've got a prescription, that doesn't mean you have to take it. If it's recommended, maybe you should. If you trust your health professionals, by all means, follow their instructions. But I am going to point out that a lot of these medications can be sidestepped, particularly if you're willing to make some changes in the habits and lifestyles. And that's my lab, the Habits and Lifestyles Lab. So you'll probably be stunned to learn I might be saying a word or two about diet and exercise and meditation and things along those lines, just to bore you to tears. So some highlights from the history of drug regulation. Now, I know this is a lot of dates and a lot of weird names, but when we get into the names, I think you'll start to notice, hey, the names of these actually make sense. And if I can remember what they mean, odds are high I can remember what the law is. And yeah, there are a couple of dates. I'm only going to focus on the first two, 1906 and 1914, Pure Food and Drug Act and the Harrison Act. The rest of these, you'll get the general trend and know what's what. The only other date that you always need to know is the Marijuana Tax Act in 1937. All right. So as you can see, these are coming up. I'm just going to go through each one individually. So 1906 was the Pure Food and Drugs Act, and the point was literally just regulate what is stated on the label. Up until then, you could have cocaine, opium, ephedra, just about anything in, and you would say patented process or secret formula or something like that, and people would take it and not even know what it had in it. As you can imagine, that led to some negative consequences. And so all we were going to do with the Pure Food and Drug Act was really make sure that whatever was in there was on the label. This also set up the FDA, for better or for worse, and at the time it was for better. And that's the Food and Drug Administration, and they're in charge of essentially saying what is and isn't safe for consumption for the American public. All right. So I want to emphasize, now you can put a psychoactive substance in there, but you've got to make sure it's also on the label. It did not eliminate potentially harmful substances. You could have opium in there, you just had to say you did. Almost immediately, this reduced the amounts used on a number of pretty dangerous things, including the opiates. And it was startling because some folks who'd been taking Dr. Poppy's magic elixir for headaches had to kick, and it was no easy feat, but people were willing to do it once they understood what it was they were taking. Okay, Pure Food and Drug Act 1906, it put what was on the label and set up the FDA. The Harrison Act of 1914. Now, unfortunately, this one is not a very intuitively named one. But what's going on, really? We're still pre-World War I, right? And the rate of opiate addiction in the U.S. is still really high. Unfortunately, folks who could quit probably quit back in 1906, right? You could still get opiates over the counter, and you could still get them by mail order, and needles and syringes were widely available, as they should be, right? All this law said was, look, from now on, if you need an opiate, you need it by prescription, and that prescription should be for a legitimate medical reason only. Now, here's where things get hairy, right? What is a legitimate medical reason. Well, hey, I'm an opiate addict. Sounds like a legitimate medical reason. Nope, sorry. So at first it was withdrawal symptoms counted as a legitimate reason, and you tried to document that you were doing better, you were cutting down, things like that, and you could still get it. But eventually they said, sorry, just because you're a junkie, you don't get it. What was the backlash? Of course, hospitalization and crime. The underground market in opiates essentially blossomed. Every time we make something illegal, let's watch what happens as we go through history. But yeah, this was an intriguing intention to help folks off of opiates. Notice that it didn't say tax things and help fund treatment centers or anything like that. But our view of addiction at the time was a little different as well. All right, so Harrison Act 1914 essentially made narcotics, particularly opiates, only available by prescription. So here I've got Pure Food and Drug Act, or Orphan Drug Act, alcohol prohibition, right? Which of these came first? Well, we know it's the Pure Food and Drug Act, right? And you got to think a minute, but just use your noggin. And which of these created the FDA? Was it the Pure Food and Drug Act, the Orphan Drug Act, or the Harrison Act? And again, we know it was the Pure Food and Drug Act. All right. Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Not the most intuitive name, but let's talk about what's going on with it, really. The event was essentially in the late 20s and early 30s, we had folks die from a poisonous ingredient in a new antibiotic. And really, there weren't any laws essentially saying, hey, not only does your medication have to be safe, never mind effective, right? We didn't really have laws saying even that the drug had to be safe. That kind of threw folks for a loop when we really sat down and thought about it. It took 5 years to pass, and I'll spare you the politics of that. It excluded existing drugs, all right? Now, some folks know, like aspirin was already around. Some other drugs had not been invented yet that we are commonly using now. Drugs now did have to be proven effective. So post, basically 1940 was the way that the law worked. You not only had to have data saying this is safe, but this drug also has to be effective for what you claim it does. Labels must contain instructions and warnings, so all those side effects and all the ways somebody might not want to use it in case they have some kind of alternative illness. And this created the class of prescription-only drugs, well, other than the opiates, right? Bottom line is now we've got to have drugs. They must be proven safe. They must be proven effective for the ailment that's relevant. You have to include instructions and warnings. This is what created prescription drugs. Basically, this set up the patriarchy, so only a physician's permission could get you certain drugs under these circumstances. And the Kefauver-Harris drug amendment. Unfortunately, this one also doesn't have a very intuitive name, but usually every third year or so, we've got somebody in the class named Harris, and I say, hey, Harris, stand up. And then I say, tell us all to get out of here, all right? Basically, this gave the FDA the right to withdraw a drug from the market if enough people had suffered negative consequences that were unforeseen. It started with the thalidomide tragedy. So this is 1962, this was passed. So my old girlfriend Candy had a brother who basically was born with no feet or hands. And he was a hell of a track runner, actually. President Nixon called him after he won some big track meet. And that was a product of his mom taking thalidomide for sleep during pregnancy, right? And now you can still get thalidomide sometimes, but there's all these tamper-evident packages on there. They do a whole bunch of stuff to make sure pregnant women don't go anywhere near it. But at the time, nobody knew. So this basically gave the FDA the right to withdraw the drug. Ads must include side effects and contraindications. So when you hear that guy at the end of the ad say, may cause exploding diarrhea. It's really fast and not particularly loud. Those are a product of this act. And the FDA started to oversee drug testing procedures more readily. So now you don't just hand over the data to the FDA. They take a bigger hand in it, and they actually got a markedly bigger budget after this. So the manufacturers not only had to do the tests that we're going to talk about when we get into the clinical trials, but they were supposed to report any adverse reactions to the FDA and to the CDC now. And basically all physicians, if somebody came to you and they had an adverse reaction to a drug or something happened to them after they took a drug that might be an adverse reaction, they had to report it. Must prove effectiveness for intended use. This is just an echoing, sort of hammering that home, and required that informed consent be obtained from subjects. So at the time, you can imagine what folks were doing in order to make money participating in these drug trials. And now everybody who's going to ingest anything in a study has a big, long, outrageous consent form that they have to read. Unfortunately, they don't read it, but they do seem willing to sign it. So by all means, anytime you've got an informed consent, make sure you read it or ask somebody to explain it to you or something along those lines, because the drug trials are not necessarily evil. It's just a lot of times we don't know what's going on or what the drug is for. So Kefauver-Harris, really the take-home message is, gives him the right to withdraw a drug. So if you can imagine some dude named Harris pulling all the drugs off the shelves, that'll be a nice way to remember. All right, hooray, the Anti-Tampering Amendment. All right, in 82, so this was basically it was my last year of high school. I was playing sports and stuff, and some bunch of morons in Illinois killed a whole family by poisoning some Tylenol, but Tylenol didn't know it at the time, so Tylenol pulled every single thing they had off the shelves, which was to their credit, and they designed the capsules that we have now that you can't open up, and all this anti-tampering packaging. So those horrible child-proof caps that drive you completely bananas and that you have to ask a child to open for you. Everything has to be properly labeled. If it's misbranded or adulterated, it's got to come off the shelves. If it's been opened at all, it should be pretty obvious from the product's packaging. And yes, any two-piece hard gel capsule must be sealed using tamper-evident technology. Now, this is only for medication. So unfortunately, as we'll get into it, supplements like herbs and stuff don't have to be in these. They can be in an open gel cap, and God only knows what people put in those. But at least for even OTC meds, over-the-counter, or any prescription drug, it's got to be tamper-resistant. So that's what the Anti-Tampering Amendment is about. I bet you can remember that. And then the Orphan Drug Act, this is the one that everybody gets confused. So, I mean, if I heard Orphan Drug Act, I would think, hey, free drugs for orphans, right? No. Unfortunately, orphan drugs are drugs that basically don't look like there's a big enough market to make much money off of, right? So one of my friends in college, Steve, had this weird, rare nasal infection, and he needed this medication that only one company made, and the pills were $7.50 a piece, and he was really bummed. Okay, but the Orphan Drug Act had already passed. That was actually what they charged. Under this act, they could have charged anything they wanted, really, and made it. Usually, if you get a drug approved this way, you don't have to pay as much to file with the FDA. So those cannabidiol trials, CBD for seizure, there's a really important subset of epilepsy that only affects kids, and it's relatively rare. And sure enough, the company got Orphan Drug Act approval, and it saved them $750,000, and they got all these tax deductions and basically paid for their clinical trials by writing off the price. And then they get 7-year exclusive marketing rights if it's approved. So that drug, obviously people are, taking side routes. But the important thing is this was a way for people who had rare disorders that needed drugs that weren't necessarily going to be lucrative for drug companies to get companies to do the research to find drugs that could help them, and then basically the government would pay for it. And by the government, I mean you and me. So Orphan Drug Act means drugs that won't necessarily make a ton of money get funded like as if they were little orphans. All right. And then the 1994 Dietary Supplement and Health Education Act, basically a whole bunch of people who owned stock in vitamin companies said, ooh, dietary supplements, they're not drugs. They're more like a food. Sure they are. All right, so it treats all the supplements more like foods. They don't need all the FDA steps that we're going to review later, unless proof that the product is unsafe. Right? Now, if somebody suddenly says, hey, this alleged supplement is killing people, then we're in trouble. So ephedra, all right, when we talk about stimulants, that one gets yanked every few years, and then somebody talks them into changing the law, and then they yank it back anyway, right? But all in all, any dietary supplement, vitamin E, St. John's wort, garlic, all your herbal stuff, it can pretty much go right to market once the manufacturer just shows that it's not poison, right? So NDA requires the manufacturer to prove safety and efficacy. DSHEA shifts the burden of proof from the manufacturer to the FDA. So this law says, no. If it's an herb, if it's something that we pretty much know is safe, we get to sell it unless you guys prove otherwise. So new dietary supplements may be placed on the market within 30 days. You have to register everything with the FDA under this law and then sell away. And I mean, truth be told, there are literally hundreds of placebos out there and some herbs that probably do have some efficacy for various things, and you can purchase them and it shouldn't be a big hassle. But plenty of them do not have randomized clinical trials with large samples that make sure it actually addresses some kind of financial issue, some kind of medical issue. Oh, so here's a sample item. Which of these types of drugs probably made companies the least money? Is it analgesics, dietary supplements, or orphan drugs? And again, you would pick orphan drugs, even though they probably didn't spend a whole lot. These are the drugs that are in fact developed because they don't have the potential to create a lot of money. All right, so yeah, if you had to guess the orphan drugs probably made the least money on these. And then what about the Dietary Supplement Act? Which of these best describes what that act does? And this is exactly the kind of question I'm going to have on the test. Does it put supplements under FDA control? Does it treat supplements more like food? Does it require clinical trials for supplements? Obviously, it's B. It treats supplements more like food. All right, well, I'd like to transition to the 4 stages of clinical testing. So if something is going to get an NDA, a new drug application at the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, we're going to have it go through these 4 stages of tests before it can get approved by the FDA for sale and use. The names are intuitive, and it's phase 1 through phase 4. And what we're doing is we're moving from healthy folks to more ill folks, the ones who have the adverse condition or whatever the medical symptoms are. And we're going to get to larger and larger samples as we go. So phase 1 trial is literally people who don't have any disorder take this just to show that it's safe. All right? Doesn't matter what they think it's for. I just got to make sure I get enough healthy volunteers to take it to show it really is safe. Now, I say 10 to 100. It really depends upon what the potential side effects are, and that's what phase 1 should show. Obviously, I'd rather see 100 than 10, given the variance and just idiographic responses we all have to drugs. But that's all it really takes to then graduate to a phase 2 trial. Now, as you can imagine, these are pricey, but we're going to have 100 to 500 patients with the medical condition. So the FDA says, all right, we approve your phase 1 data set. We want to supervise your phase 2 trial. Tell us exactly what you're going to do. So you're going to explain exactly how you're going to recruit these folks, what disorder they have, what symptoms you're going to monitor, what kind of impact you think it's going to have, and you run it all again. All right. Now, if it actually looks like it's doing what you thought it was going to do without ridiculous side effects, FDA says, okay, fill out all this paperwork, give us a bunch of money, and we'll do phase 3 now. Now you want to have between 1,000 and 3,000 patients, and obviously this is trials. You're going to get multiple sites if you can. Try to get that sample size to at least 1,000. The hope is you might be able to illustrate some range of dosage on this with the side effects. Try to find the dose that's lowest that still has reasonable medical efficacy. Really do a great job of documenting any potential side effects, any weird interactions with other meds, things like that. You give the FDA those data, and in all honesty, most drugs don't even make it to phase 3, and getting out of phase 3 is a huge deal. But then the FDA says, okay, send it out. And then the physicians are basically responsible for the phase 4 trials, right? People can continue to study it if they want to add other ways that they think it works, or they want to say, hey, this is not only good for this disorder, but it's also good for symptoms of this other one. And then the physicians report any adverse reactions, ideally to the drug company, the FDA, and the CDC. And then obviously it's already available commercially, but at least then there's still the chance through that Kefauver-Harris Act, right, to yank it should something bad happen. But we also get the opportunity to do some of the longer term follow-up and just see what its efficacy is like. Is it really worth having out on the market? And so on. All right. This looks like a good place for a break. Give yourself 5 minutes, write down a summary, write yourself a few questions, dance around, watch a little comedy, and we'll pick it up in over-the-counter meds too.